Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. As folks are logging in, a couple logistical items before we start. One, we are recording this press call, so we'll make sure that everybody gets a link to the recording afterwards. Two is you can ask questions one of two ways. We'll take questions at the end after the speakers give remarks. So you can either click the raise your hand button or you can type your question in the Q&A dialog box. So we'll read those type questions out loud when we get to Q&A at the end. Or if you click the raise your hand button, we'll unmute you so you can ask your question out loud once we get to the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Joanne Kilgour, who is Executive Director at the Ohio River Valley Institute. Joanne?
Thanks so much, John. Good morning, and thank you all for joining today's press call. We're here to discuss a critical situation that has been affecting businesses, community service organizations, and municipalities across the Commonwealth, one that demands our immediate attention and continued vigilance. The Trump administration recently took the unprecedented step of withholding over $2.1 billion in congressionally approved federal funding from Pennsylvania. This illegal action threatened our essential programs that lower electricity bills for families, create good-paying jobs, protect our communities, and clean up environmental hazards. This funding freeze impacted crucial programs, including abandoned mine reclamation, the RISE PA Clean Manufacturing Initiatives, Solar for All program, home energy efficiency and weatherization assistance, and vital orphaned well plugging projects. These are not just line items in a budget. They represent real investments in Pennsylvania's communities, our workers, and our families. Thanks to Governor Shapiro's swift legal action and leadership, much of this funding has now been unfrozen. This is a significant victory for Pennsylvania, but I want to emphasize that our work is not done. While many state-administered programs have been restored, some local governments and organizations are still waiting for their promised federal support. This continued uncertainty is unacceptable. The economic impact of this funding freeze was immediate and severe. Local contractors had to pause weatherization work, environmental cleanup projects were put on hold, job-creating initiatives were thrown into chaos. While we've managed to restore much of this funding, this disruption has created unnecessary hardship for Pennsylvania businesses and workers. Today, you'll hear directly from Pennsylvanians impacted by this funding freeze, as well as experts who've modeled the benefit of this funding on our workers and the economy. They'll share their stories about what these programs mean for their communities. These are the real faces behind the numbers, and their stories illustrate exactly why this funding is so critical. While we're grateful for the progress that we've made, again, we must remain vigilant. The governor's lawsuit continues because we need to ensure that all promised funding reaches Pennsylvania communities and that future funding remains secure. We cannot take anything for granted when it comes to protecting these vital investments. We're also calling on members of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation who have not yet taken action on behalf of their constituents to join Governor Shapiro in this fight. This is not a partisan issue. It's about standing up for Pennsylvania families, workers, and communities. It's about ensuring that our congressionally appropriated funds reach their intended recipients and deliver the benefits our communities were promised. Let me conclude by emphasizing that this is still very much a developing situation. We must remain ready to defend these vital investments whenever they come under threat. And it's important to understand how problematic uncertainty about already committed funding can be for folks across the Commonwealth doing vital work in their communities. The current state of chaos and uncertainty around these funds, as you'll hear, is affecting urban, suburban, and rural communities alike. I'll now turn it over to Bobby Hughes, Executive Director at the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, who will discuss multiple programs his organization runs and how the uncertainties with federal funding has affected their ability to complete these critical projects. Bobby?
Thank you, Joanne. For everybody, my name is Bobby Hughes. I'm the executive director for the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation. We are a nearly 30-year-old regional environmental nonprofit that works in north central and northeastern Pennsylvania's bituminous and anthracite coal region in coalfield communities that have been heavily impacted by legacy abandoned mines and polluted mine water. And we partner with a number of conservation districts, community watershed organizations, regional nonprofits, the coal industry in the anthracite region, the cogeneration power producers, and take in waste coal, and also our local municipalities to serve as sort of a liaison between the state and federal agencies where a lot of this funding is available to do both assessment, monitoring, and reclamation work for economic development, recreational opportunities, environmental education opportunities for our schools, and also to see that our waterways are cleaned up to be reused for recreational purposes and just clean water in general in the communities we work with. I was going to touch on a few of the projects that we had to give examples of the type of work that we are doing with a number of federal and state funding sources that are coming in that during the pause, we're mostly in a reimbursement based process with a number of the federal grants. So we have to have some funds in our sort of kitty to be able to carry that cash flow and be able to make the subcontract agreements and to be able to put money out before we can take money in. And we do that without loans. And we kind of don't have a lot of assets in terms of things that we might be able to liquidate if a bank was to ask us for something while we're trying to have some money in terms of when these cash flows might occur throughout the year as projects are sort of worked and being paid for various aspects of construction or design or permitting or our field work and even equipment purchases and monitoring and lab type of testing that goes on with the work that we do. But I was going to give you some examples where we are doing some capacity building and research on mine pool geothermal potential for a site in a formerly reclaimed abandoned mine that still has a water-filled stripping pit in northern Schuylkill County that we went and had a capacity building meeting the other night, which we had some great turnout from the community that we've been building over the last 4 or 5 months. And the project that was funded through the Department of Energy is a fossil community program that is looking at coalfield communities to not only build capacity but obtain data and come up with ideas for the potential reuse of a site that has been formerly reclaimed for potential solar energy development, mine pool geothermal, and that could be utilized by potential build out of data centers in this particular area. So that portal that we have to receive those funds, although it's still open, there's a backlog of just waiting for those funds. And so while we've submitted some invoices through that particular portal, we are, patiently awaiting those funds to come in. So it's sort of critical in terms of waiting for those funds when we've already outlaid time and effort. Another example is we're working on a watershed assessment in the southern end of the Wyoming Valley in Luzerne County, and it's the Shickshinny Creek watershed, and a large majority of this area is on the former Stackhouse Colliery that's on State Game Lands 260 that we have a partnership with that has mining impacts where the headwaters of one of the streams goes into the mines and comes out as mine drainage, and it needs monitoring and it needs sort of evaluation. And other sites in that watershed have discharges that go to a trout stream that goes to the Susquehanna River, and it's being impacted and hasn't been treated yet for any of those particular discharges. So that assessment work that's going on, we've applied for some funds through the Pennsylvania Council of Trout Limited, and their funding is coming from DCNR through a state program called C2, P2, and they've just held off on making those announcements officially and getting the paperwork out to everybody for those grants. And I think it's being held up potentially by some delays in the funding that maybe some of the C2P2 has a tie to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Another project is land reclamation of health and safety sites that we're working on that are stripping pits that are abandoned. And there's a development project for a commercial warehouse distribution center in the Hazel Township area of Luzerne County, and we received some funding to do that work. And while it was a part of the bill funding, we're just getting started with that and just trying to get the landowner access agreement in place. But we know that those funds were a part of bill, and there was more of a thing on the other end where the state was probably having some issues with getting the money allocated into the state funds through their ASAP system, is what we were told. But that shouldn't really affect us going forward with this particular project here. Another project that we're looking at doing is right now a mine pool feasibility project in just in the area south of this other project we were doing in northern Schuylkill County that has been funded by the Conservation District in Schuylkill County, and we are a partner with them to evaluate the mine pools to maybe move some mine discharges from one watershed and go to another area in another watershed on the other side in the same Schuylkill River drainage, but where there is land available for potential treatment of that mine water. So that's a project that we haven't been able to get our sub agreement in place yet because the Conservation District is a little bit held up in being able to finish getting that work out to us. So there's just a few examples of some of the projects that we are working on that are both state and federally funded that I think have ties to federal funding. And what we're doing in lieu of that is trying to reach out to our local foundations, like the Foundation for PA Watershed, the Luzerne Foundation, the Just Transition Fund, because we're trying to seek some funding for the organizational capacity that we need for our very small staff. We're only four folks funded full-time, 2 part-time positions, and they're pretty much entirely grant funded unless we supplement that with some additional capacity building funds that we can get from the foundations in our area. And those funds provide the money that pays for the staff, our travel, the equipment to do the monitoring, and our coordination efforts that we do with our partners in the region. So yeah, in the last month or so, it's kind of thrown us a little bit of a loop, and we have a board meeting coming up tomorrow that will be sharing a lot of updates on things that have happened and a lot of where the projects are at this point in time. But we don't want to kind of fall behind in this, and we're not in a position to get involved in any kind of litigation because we don't have lawyers that would be able to do that. We don't have the funds to be able to do that, and really don't want to do that because that could jeopardize future federal funding projects if you have to tell them that you're in litigation, with other funding programs that are out there. And that's not something we want to do. We want to continue to do the work on the ground in these watersheds that are heavily impacted by mining, that are very underserved. They're in environmental justice communities, whether you want to label them that or not. The pollution, is readily seen, and the scars on the land are there. And those are the things that we're trying to clean up to benefit the quality of life of the folks that we're working with in our region.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thanks for all the work of EPCAMR throughout the communities that you serve. I'd now like to turn it over to James Weitzel, the Unionville Chadds Ford School District Director of Facilities, to discuss the impact of the funding freeze on electric school buses and the ramifications for their school district. James?
Thank you, Joanne, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present our story here today. We are a small, proud school district located in Chester County, PA, and one of the few in our area that still maintains its own in-house bus fleet and in-house drivers. Just over a year ago, in partnership with Highland Electric Fleets, we applied for the EPA Clean School Bus Grant. And then last May, we were thrilled to be awarded a $1 million EPA rebate grant. which provided $200,000 per bus towards the purchase of 5 electric buses. We also received an additional $300,000 from a state grant, and combined, these grants made purchasing electric buses more cost-effective than purchasing traditional diesel buses. So last November, our board approved the purchase of 5 electric buses, and we placed a purchase order with the vendor to ensure delivery for the start of the new school year. Simultaneously, we also began design work for the necessary electrical infrastructure upgrades to accommodate the additional chargers that would be needed for these additional buses. Then the federal budget freeze in late January introduced significant uncertainty for us. This past month, our board was scheduled to vote on the electrical upgrades that were costing approximately $200,000. And we just postponed the vote for a month, hoping to get some more clarity on the situation. We were hesitant to commit to additional costs if there was a possibility that our $1 million grant might be canceled. So now, while we remain hopeful that this situation will resolve itself favorably, we are facing a time constraint. Due to the necessity of replacing buses and the time required for electrical infrastructure installation, we must make a decision soon. So in mid-March, our school board is going to vote either to proceed with the electric buses or to abandon the project and purchase 5 diesel buses instead. Choosing the diesel bus route will entail, higher upfront costs for us, and also eliminate operational and maintenance savings, which are offered by the electric buses. And over the lifespan of those buses, this decision could result in hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost savings for our community. So finally, I just want to wrap up, and I want to applaud the governor for standing up for PA, showing strong leadership, to oppose the unconstitutional freeze of these federal funds. And the governor's unwavering commitment to the citizens of Pennsylvania demonstrates a strong commitment to protecting the rights and interests of Pennsylvanians and sets a powerful example for other leaders across the nation. So thank you again for the opportunity this morning to share our story and where we are with things.
We really appreciate you being here with us today, James. And now I'd like to invite my colleague Ted Bettner, a senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, to speak about funding for plugging and capping orphan and abandoned oil and gas wells. Ted?
Hey, great. Thank you so much, Joanne. It's great to be here with everybody today. As folks on the call probably know, Pennsylvania is often considered ground zero for the orphaned and abandoned well crisis. We have about 27,000 documented orphan wells in the state, together with an estimated 341,000 undocumented orphan wells that we're finding every day. Many of these wells are leaking harmful methane gas. They're also contaminating water supplies and farmland, potentially lowering property values for surface owners and impairing economic development throughout the Commonwealth. The federal grants included in the bipartisan infrastructure law contain about $400 million for the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is next just to Texas in terms of getting the largest allocation of these funds. So far, we've been able to spend about $25 million, which was included in the initial grant to plug about 200 wells. And there's an additional $300 million in formula grants. And we are also eligible for about $70 million in performance-based grants from the program. While the state has spent the initial $25 million, the phase 1 of the formula grant, which is about $76.4 million, was awarded recently, but then frozen. As we talked about earlier, the unfreezing of these funds has allowed things to commence since last week, but it's created a large amount of uncertainty in Pennsylvania. and has already led to oil and gas service companies holding back operations. The one thing businesses do not like is uncertainty, and that's what the funding freeze has created for many of the people working in this. What was a smaller industry is now growing into a more robust industry across the state. Most of the work cleaning up orphan wells is in economically distressed areas where the oil and gas production has taken place in the past. And it's also a place where oil and gas employment has declined rapidly over the last decade. The remaining $300 million in federal orphan well grants could create an estimated 3,000 full-time equivalent jobs in the Commonwealth. These are jobs our local communities and workers desperately need. And this is an industry that has a very bright future in the state that needs to be supported. So pulling the rug out from people working in this industry and creating this uncertainty has given pause to whether this funding will continue in the future. So it's imperative that the bipartisan funding for cleaning up the wells not only continues, but that we take the steps necessary to strengthen the program so we can address the hundreds of thousands of abandoned wells across the state. While we have just scratched the surface of tackling hazardous abandoned wells in the state, we have made tremendous progress over the last couple of years, and we have so much more to do. We just can't freeze out our local businesses and workers or stop making our state healthier. And we need to create a state that is a better place to live, work, and raise a family. And that's why this funding is so crucial going forward, because nobody benefits more from orphan well cleanup as much as Pennsylvania. And it's important to our families, our local communities, and to improve the well-being of the citizens of the Commonwealth. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ted. And thank you to all of our speakers for being here to share your experience and expertise. And thanks also to those who joined. John, I can hand things back to you.
Thanks, Joanne. A reminder, if folks have a question, feel free to click the raise your hand button, or you can type that question in the Q&A dialog box. And I will filibuster for a minute to see if we have any questions, and remind folks that we recorded the webinar. So we'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the recording. And I will put my information in that email. So if you want to connect with any of the speakers afterwards, just let me know. We'll make sure that happens. All right, great. So Reed, I am going to click a button, and I think it will allow you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question. Go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep, we got you, Reed. Go
Okay,
ahead. Yep.
great. Bobby, this question is mainly directed to you, but if anybody else wants to chime in, what was your reaction when you found out that the funds for abandoned mine lands cleanup were frozen? And what is your, I mean, how does this affect your going forward? You know, are you worried at all that future funding could be subject to, you know, similar freezes, and or the current Congress and administration are looking for ways to pay for a tax cut? Are you worried that future funds could be reversed? You know, Pennsylvania was promised a lot in the bipartisan infrastructure law for mine cleanups. But if anybody wants to chime in afterwards with, you know, just how they, what their experience has been like with this funding freeze, be my guest.
Sure, I can try and tackle that. You know, we were very concerned because what folks may not understand is that, you know, for these types of projects to even get to the point where we want to get to cleanup and reclamation, there are things that have to take place before that, like development of a plan for restoration and reclamation. And that involves monitoring, and in most cases, in places that the communities don't have any monitoring available for both the quality of the water and the chemistry and the flow to be able to determine how big of a treatment system do we have to scale this to when these federal funds that were coming in that were going to be mostly some of it was set aside for the long-term operation and maintenance of discharges if new treatment systems were going to be considered and proposed for cleaning up a number of these discharges, which in the anthracite region, they are very, very high volume. And their metals are mostly iron and aluminum laden discharges, but in some cases you need water treatment plant size scale to take care of the water, and it's millions of dollars of investment that would be needed. And so in doing that and having a loss for those type of funds to enable us to think about it in that way and to do some of the assessment work, which is what we do on the ground, that some of these funds come in to do that type of boots on the ground monitoring, purchasing of those equipments for the community watershed groups that we work with and provide technical assistance to, as well as the conservation districts. And EPCAMR does a lot of surface and underground mine mapping for the state, and those maps are what help us determine, just how big of a volume of water we're talking about, and are there ways to redirect flows to different areas. So the funding is critical for those type of projects. And the land reclamation side of things, when we're doing reclamation and we're partnering with private investment companies that want to do big, say if they're warehouse distribution or manufacturing facilities or solar type projects, they want to also have sites that if there is federal money available on those lands that are owned by private companies, if there's state or federal funds that can take care of those health and safety sites while they're bringing in X millions of dollars for the actual construction of the facilities and then the job development and economic development to follow. And we're helping them to look at developing community benefits plans for the community. And that's what these funds kind of allow us to do a lot of that. So it's very critical that those funds continue to come into PA that has 5,560 miles of streams included by abandoned mine drainage, and well over 100 some thousand acres of abandoned mine lands that are documented that still need reclamation. But with those funds not coming into PA, which I think is probably one of the third largest in the Mid-Atlantic region and Northern Appalachia, to have to reclaim these sites, it would be a huge loss to Pennsylvania for that money to go away. So, the governor's position he's taken to try and look to get that money back to where it needs to go. We're supportive of that. And we're also looking at other things that I know in the current administration, they're talking about rare earth elements and critical minerals, and there's potential for that work to still be done while we're sampling these areas for the discharges, because along with that, while we're sampling and getting flow and chemistry, if there was enough money put there for the sampling of the rare earth elements, you can then determine these various load-in rates of those elements that might be also found in the mine drainage potentially.
Thanks for your question, Reed, and thanks so much, Bobby. Would anyone else like to address Reed's question about what your reaction was when you found out that funds were frozen, how it might affect you going forward, and whether you're worried about future funding that could be subject to a similar freeze?
I can share real quick. I think when we first heard, our initial reaction was obviously disappointment. We had worked hard on the grant application, and the grant funds were certainly critical to the success of the implementation of these electric buses. And then that disappointment transitioned into a concern, because we had already done a PO to a bus manufacturer back in November. So the buses were in production, right? So without the funds, we weren't going to be able to support the purchase, and we didn't know if we were going to be subject to, if we canceled the PO, some money that we would be out regardless of whether we went forward or not. So that was a concern. So really it was disappointment and then concern, and now we're just kind of hoping that things resolve itself, and hopeful that our portal, the rebate portal from the EPA, will open up and allow us to move forward with this project here in the short term.
And I just wanted to underscore something that Bobby raised, which was that many of these programs are set up in a reimbursement style. So first you have to outlay the funds and then apply to be reimbursed. So it's not simply that the funding portal being reopened is going to solve all the problems of uncertainty, but it's the cash flow elements and being able to ensure that reimbursements are processed in a timely manner. So not only do we have to remain vigilant about whether the funds are frozen or not, but we also have to remain vigilant about whether they're being reimbursed and distributed in a timely manner to allow these fantastic projects to move forward and benefit our communities.
Thanks, Reed. Before we go to the next question, Reed, any follow-ups? Want to make sure that we don't cut you off.
Not at the moment. I might think of something.
All right, thank you. Just to flag also, there's some links in the chat from our panelists, so want to make sure that folks see those as well. And I'm also still filibustering in case there are other questions.
Well, actually, can I
Yeah, of course.
throw
Go
another
ahead.
question out? I guess I'm not muted. Ted, can you tell me a little bit more about some of your contractors stopping work? Like what happened? They were contracted to do something, and then the funding became up in the air. What happened?
Yeah, as you know, I mean, historically, Pennsylvania has only spent, upwards of just $1 million or $2 plugging wells over the last several decade or two. And so this has, generally speaking, been a sort of a boutique industry in terms of oil and gas well service plugging. So this initial money of 25 million and the additional, over 375 million was beginning to create, more contractors, more people interested in doing this work and scaling up those operations. There was an article in I think the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette recently quoting one of the contractors, Plants and Goodwin, as saying this has been a reason they've had to scale back a lot of their operations in the industry. So that's just one example of a contractor doing that. It's hard to say exactly how many others have been faced with those similar predicaments. But anytime you're taking something that's a relatively small industry and trying to scale it up, and you're creating uncertainty in doing that, and these companies have to meet payroll just like everybody else, it creates a lot of pressure to not hire as many workers and to put off things. So if anything, this freeze has really probably has caused a delay in those companies being able to make those capital investments and to bring competition into that contracting process. Did that answer your question, Reed?
Yeah, it sounded like you had folks that were fulfilling contracts that had to just like stop because in the middle. That's not, sounds like that maybe wasn't what you meant.
Yeah, that's basically
Okay.
refer to several of the contractors, talk to them personally if that's something you're interested in doing.
Yeah, I may want to follow up with you afterwards about that.
Yeah, feel free to follow up and I'll supply what I can.
Great.
Thanks, Reed. So I got a question I'm going to read from the Q&A dialog box. This question is for Bobby, but if anyone else can add, please do. Can you describe exactly how the federal money flows and what is the landscape of government offices and nonprofits that get mine or well reclamation done, and how does a temporary cutoff affect them?
Well, I mean, how the money flows. Typically, if you're directly funded by a federal agency program, it will go through a subcontractor that typically does the grant management, and then that grant would be through a business to business agreement with us as another a grant agreement that we have that would then allow us to submit our progress on projects through a portal that's set up for reimbursement once we complete certain milestones, and a percentage of those funds are then given to us through the portal. That's if it's a federally directed, direct project from the federal agency. If it's coming through the state, which in Pennsylvania, a lot of the funds come through the state through various programs. If it's coming down from other agencies like the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency or the Office of Surface Mine and Reclamation and Enforcement for the Abandoned Mine Land Trust Fund funds, or the BIL bipartisan funds, that goes to the state and is run through their state coffers and then into the Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation that administers those AMD and AML grants that they're called, that they have sort of rolling cycles of funding that can be applied for. But you go through them to vet your project in a sense first, to make sure you have things that are ready to go to be proposed. So it runs that way, and those grants are reimbursement grants. So you have to find out, if you've got enough money to outlay before you can pay someone, or in your agreements with the subcontractors, you tell them, you can invoice us and we will submit the invoice. And then when that turns around through the state system, we would then be able to pay you. And so that's how we have been able to operate on some occasions with some of our grants. And then there are other times where we're utilizing other funds that have come in from foundation that would cover those costs up front, since there's oftentimes not a lot of like working capital provided in some of these situations. So that makes it a little more challenging. And there are a number of groups across Pennsylvania. We run a statewide conference that's funded under one of these grant programs for clean water through the non-point source program of DEP. And we run an annual conference on abandoned mine reclamation. And last year in October, it was our 26th annual conference. And we had worked with two other partners to develop a survey of watershed groups and conservation districts on how are they doing with the bill funding? Are they applying for it? What do they need? And we were getting feedback on capacity issues for a lot of the groups that are very small, not used to these very large 6 or 7 figure projects. And they needed tech assistance, they needed support, they needed legal assistance and financial management assistance. And that was all given out through a highlighted survey summary that we worked on with the Pennsylvania Organization for Watersheds and Rivers and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, who are soon to be releasing, we hope, the full report of that survey work that we did. But we had highlighted the summaries of that particular effort last year that took in around 70 some community organizations and conservation districts we worked with across the state to get their input. And we found that to be pretty eye-opening in terms of where they're at in terms of capacity and their ability to not only apply for the funds, but them telling us they don't even have monitoring equipment and things in the field that would help them to determine what the proper data is to submit to justify some of the projects without having that in place on the front end of many of these projects. So, it's impacting many groups in a lot of ways across PA, working on AMD and land reclamation issues.
Thanks, Bobby. And Ian, if you, feel free to raise your hand or type if you have a follow-up, or if you'd like to be connected afterwards, like we said, more than happy to connect you with Bobby or any of the speakers. All right, so that was my last attempt to filibuster, maybe. Joanne, in a minute, let me turn it over to you to close. But I just thank all the reporters who were able to get on. We'll send a link to the recording, like I said, and let me know if you have any follow-ups or want to connect with any of the speakers afterwards. We really appreciate you taking time to jump on. Joanne, why don't I turn it back to you quickly just to wrap?
Thanks so much, John. And thanks again to all of our speakers. We really, really appreciate you being here to share what the real world impact of this has been. And I just like to reiterate that, again, we've shown here today that these federal funding programs support real critical work that impacts families, communities, workers, and our economy across the Commonwealth. And again, these are not just line items in a budget. They represent real investments that real people are relying on. So thank you all again for being here. And as John mentioned, we're happy to be connected for follow-up.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our speakers. Also, everybody have a great rest of your day.
Take care, all.
Bye.